This is part 3 of the talk presented at USF Osher Senior Learning sometime in 2017 on History of India. We ended the last talk with the end of the Mughal Empire, and the famous emperor who ruled at that time was named Aurangzeb, who ruled for almost 39 to 40 years. And at that time, he succeeded in conquering India from north to south, but his reign was marred by constant battles and military adventures to the southern part, which he conquered but was never able to control. And at that time, there was a big challenge that had risen to him for more than 100 years, starting from present-day Bombay, and that was the rise of the Maratha Empire. And so these two battles went back and forth between the Maratha Empire and King Aurangzeb. And little did then either of them know that in another 100 years, events that took place about 6,000 miles away from them would influence their outcome. And that event was in 31st December 1600. As you may recall, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, setting up the competition between various European empires for the control of the spice trade. And the Portuguese made their home base in Goa and acted as a middleman for spice trade. And on the other hand, the Dutch established their colonies in Indonesia. And the English were rather late to the arrival of the scene, but they were not. But they were the ones who eventually succeeded. And the reasons for that are their naval superiority and the financial arrangements that they established. Now, unlike other European powers, the English was a private company that was established by Earl of Cumberland and 215 other who's who of British society, and they invested considerable sum at that time of almost 500 pounds for trading in the East. And first, as you may recall, they landed on the west coast of India and in a seaport called Surat. And from there, they marched to the court of Emperor Jahangir, who was the father of the builder of the famous Taj Mahal, and were granted trading privileges. Now, for about 100 years or first 50, they coexisted and were primarily traders and were not interested in causing or getting into a political scuffle. Now, interesting side tech was that the competition between the Dutch and English was rather fierce, and that extended to a small bunch of islands in the Indonesian. Now, Indonesia, as you may recall, is about 10,000 small islands, and out of which a special group of islands called Banda Islands, which is really a tiny volcanic post somewhere in the Banda Sea. You know, the other islands are a lot bigger, primarily Java, Borneo, but this is a small speck. Now, even among the small speck, there is even a smaller thing, as you can see in the picture on the left-hand side, and that is a small island called Pulau Run. And the Sultan of Pulau Run had granted privileges to the Dutch to trade there, and the commodity that they were trading for was nutmeg, which was extremely valuable, and the traders generated a profit of as much as 2,500% in Europe. So that was a prized commodity, and no wonder the competition for that was fierce between. And the ramifications of the Anglo-Dutch War from 1603 extended as far east as Pulau Run, and the control of the Pulau Run island went back and forth between these two European powers. And now sometimes the Dutch won, sometimes the English won. And not so how the competition was fierce that when the Dutch had to turn the control to the English, they managed to cut all the nutmeg trees. Now finally the peace was settled, and the islands were permanently turned over to the Dutch because they control large part of Indonesia, and or East Indies as it was called at the time. And in return, the English did not come empty-handed. They got a small series of islands in the new colonies of America, primarily New York, which was settled by the Dutch in those days. And the islands that they got is very familiar to all of you. It's called Manhattan. And this is a rather sad but amusing example of the competition, because the English were not about spying and for trade secrets, and some of the English merchants were arrested by the Dutch, and they were integrated rather vigorously, to put it mildly, and as the picture depicts, they were tortured by pouring water over their face, and the faces was covered, and this could be, it's well exemplified from the Iraq War, where the practice of waterboarding was made infamous. And this is the city where they landed. It's on the west coast of India. It's called Surat, and some of the old buildings of the Dutch establishment, those, for some reason, they were called factories. Primarily they were just trading posts to gather goods from the interiors and export it by sea around the Cape of Good Hope. And again, that there were several European powers there, not just the Dutch, but English and Portuguese, and some naval scuffles went along. Now the Mughals were somewhat oblivious to the growing presence and power of the European powers, but on one occasion the English pirates, who were operating freely, did attack a Mughal ship which was going on the sacred Hajj, and they were taught a lesson. And at that time the English paid several £1,000s of penalty, and apologized, and were allowed to continue to operate. So that was one of the incidents where the Mughal Empire showed their might. And as how important the island of city of Surat was, it is well apparent in the painting, which is on one of the Holland America ships, the view of Surat, that was painted by a Dutch painter named Johannes Wingeboens as far back as 1665, and that's proudly demonstrated in the National Archives in the Netherlands. And these were just to refresh your memory, these were the earlier settlers. Sir Thomas Raw, who went to the court of Jahangir, and that was the start of the English trading. And again, he was followed by several other English sailors and diplomats, including William Hawkins, Nicholas Withington, and Sir Thomas Raw was the last of the series, who arrived sometime in 1615 and stayed for about 3 years. And now Surat was the port of Surat was getting filled with silt and was losing its natural harbor. So at that time, a marriage that took place with a Portuguese Princess Catherine, and Charles II of Britain, and as part of the dowry, a small series of islands on the west coast of India were given as a gift. And these islands were originally a fishing village, and subsequently were under control of the local tribal people, the fishermen, and the Maratha Empire. And subsequently the Portuguese managed to capture them and had used them as a seaport. But the English realized that it was a natural harbor, and most of the commercial traffic gradually over the next 100 years switched to Bombay from Surat. And now, just to get an idea of the geography, the India was divided into two major powers. One was the Mughal Empire, and the second was the Maratha Empire that controlled most of the south. And the border between the two was in flux and went back and forth depending upon how strong, who was on the winning side. And the other major settlers were the French, who arrived about the same time for trading. Now, the difference between the French and the English was that the French was a government-owned trading company, and that was rather poorly financed. And their navy, they had poor navy support as well. And when the 7-Year War took place between England and France, the ramification of that extended to southern India as well. And the fighting was intense because they were both trained in European fashion and obviously wanted to maintain superiority as to their clients, which were Indian Maharajas and local princes. And the fighting went back and forth, and sometimes the French had upper hand, but they did not get enough support from the mother country, and hence and finally at the conclusion of the Anglo-French 7-Year War, the French agreed not to pursue any further colonies in India, but they were allowed to keep what they already had, and they continued to do so until 1948. And a city on the west coast of India named Pondicherry still shows a very strong cultural influence, as is apparent in some of the names and street names. Now, an interesting character that is most familiar with most of the Americans is a guy named Elihu Yale. Yes, the same one for whom the famous university is named. How did he happen to be in India? Because, again, realize at that time there was no America, and he went to Britain and as a merchant and was successful, and was appointed a governor of Fort St. George, which was subsequently went on to be called Madras. And at that time, the East India Company traders were all freelancers, even though they were employed by the company, and were not averse to trading illegally on the side and making huge profits. And he indulged in various smuggling activities from the west coast of India. And again, at that time, not only English, but there were French, there were Armenians, Jews, all sorts of traders were out there to make fortune. Now, after being successful at making fortune, he returned to England. At that time, he was asked for some contribution to start a college in the colonies by Reverend Winthrop. And that was the founding of the Yale College, which went on to become Yale University. So that shows the extent of the globalization and transfer of people that took place between the New World, the Old World, and Asia, or Orient as it was called in those days. Now, what were the main items that was being traded? One of the most important ones was something called saltpeter. Now, what is saltpeter? It is chemically potassium nitrate that was used in gunpowder, and this was a big commercial venture and was mined in India and was sold all over Europe for substantial profit. And this was one of the items that was exported. And again, the East India Company had to make sure that His Majesty's government was well supplied. And and now what did they have to return? Because they did not have payment. They had sheep and wool, but the Indians were not interested in buying that. So they exported in hard currency, primarily silver and gold. And this was the amount of silver that was exported in a span of only 5 years, was as high as 3 million pounds of silver, and the gold bullion of about another couple of 100,000 pounds. So that was a substantial amount of sum for that time. So the balance of trade was substantially in the favor of the Mughal Empire and Indians. Now, as you can see, that the changed dramatically over the span of next 100 years. And the other cash crop that was in demand was indigo, because indigo was used as a natural dye for clothing, and the more vigorous cultivation started sometime in 1777, and by that time the English had conquered part of the Bengal, as we'll see how they went about doing that. And the local farmers were forced to grow indigo at the cost of growing food. And this, again, not surprisingly, caused a famine in few years. And so much so that it moved one of the clergymen named Reverend Long, who published a play that was written by a local Bengali. And needless to say, it did not go well with the establishment. And there was, even as far back as it was indigo revolt, and that continued even in the 20th century. You may recall that from the movie Gandhi. The other main item was silk, which was a prized import from the Orient, and via China it was grown in India and was exported to Europe in major trading centers of Surat, Mysore, and central India. So King Cotton should be mentioned equally, that it was a major export from India at that time, and the Indian weavers were very skilled craftsmen and were able to weave the finest clothing, which was called chintz and calico. These words gradually became part of the English language and were in high demand in Europe for clothing as well as for decoration of the household items. And then subsequently, so India was exporting a finished product, and this again changed after the Industrial Revolution starting in United Kingdom, and India became exporter of raw material. And obviously there were far-reaching implications that took place after the Civil War in the colonies or Americas. So, and again later on after the Civil War, there was a rise of cotton industry in India that took place by the local businessmen who, with the collaboration of the English, established several mills on the west coast of India. And Bombay, until very recently, had at least 20 or 30 mills, and now they've all fallen out of favor, and the production have moved elsewhere in the interiors. And now again, this is an example of some of the French colonies that is well apparent in this map. And one of the famous generals for that time, his name was Dupleix. And again, he was handicapped by the lack of support from the mother country. And now a few Indians did travel to Britain primarily as sailors, and some of them were brought by missionaries. And the first Indian who arrived was a young boy who was baptized by one of the missionary men, and he was given a new name of Peter Pope. And his arrival in Britain caused considerable excitement and commotion because they had never seen a dark-skinned person, and he might have been an inspiration for one of the characters in the famous Shakespearean play Tempest. Now again, the Industrial Revolution in Europe had far-reaching implications on Indian subcontinent, as well as we'll examine in next few slides. Now, at that time, the other big establishment was Calcutta, because that was a big trade center for refined cotton, and the weavers of northern India were very famous, and that was one of the major exporting port in Calcutta. And that time again, the Dutch and the French and the English had colonies. Bengal was at that time was under control of local Nawab, and the English were reluctant to pay their share of taxes. So finally the Nawab became furious and decided to kick the English out. And and they did lose Calcutta colony for a while, and that again they decided to teach the Nawab a lesson, and a small army of European trained soldiers marched by land and sea to Calcutta, and that set up the first confrontation that took place. Now, before the English army could reach from the southern tip to Calcutta, several Europeans were held prisoners in hot, humid weather in a small room, and due to suffocation, starvation, and possibly infection, several of them died, and that gave rise to the big historical event that was well publicized in Britain called Black Hole of Calcutta. And again, there are several conflicting versions as to the numbers kept getting exaggerated as to how many people died. And but again, that was a big stain and cause of revenge for the British. And the founding father of the British Empire can be rightly given credit to this man. He's well known, so much so that a Hollywood movie was made in his name. He was a rather minor character, and he went to India to work for East India Company as a clerk. And but again, he was disappointed and was almost willing to commit suicide. But then he turned. At that time, the French had attacked the Fort St. George, and Clive single-handedly took the initiative and decided to, and was able to lead a small battalion to repel the attack. And so he finally found his calling. He was a much better soldier and a leader of the English soldiers as well as the sepoys. By this time, both European countries, France and England, had learned that the Indians with European training were made excellent soldiers and were willing to work for whosoever paid their salary. At that time, obviously the nationalistic feeling had not evolved sufficiently enough, but they were willing to work for the foreign powers. And so he succeeded in defeating the French in southern India, and again he was given the lead for relief of Calcutta. So he marched to Calcutta and managed to confront the Muslim Nawab of that era, and that is the famous Battle of Plassey. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these were some of the causes of the Battle of Plassey: the illegal use of the what it was called dastak, which was a permit for export trade that was granted, and they were selling it on the side to avoid paying taxes to the local king. And again, so that was one of the big reasons. Now, to his credit, Clive, with a relatively smaller army but well trained and with better guns and weaponry, was able to defeat a large army of about 90,000 of the local Nawab. And as part of the settlement, they managed to get control of the whole Bengal province, which was rich in agriculture product, cotton, and they were allowed to raise taxes. And some of the agents who were the locals who collaborated with them, and they ruthlessly persecuted the farmers in the rural areas in collecting revenue, causing further a rise in the poverty, which was already there, endemic. Now, again, the battle was settled by giving bribe to the uncle of the local Nawab, and also with the collaboration of the Indian merchants who were promised a huge amount of bribe. Now, as part of the booty, Clive managed to become substantially rich, and it's so much so that when he returned back to Britain, he was able to buy a seat in Parliament and was able to live out the rest of his life as a gentleman. Now, again, the English are never tired to say that the empire was created accidentally, and to some extent they are right, because the circumstances of the local kings were so that there was substantial infighting, and there was no local power that was able to realize the seriousness of the threat from the foreign powers. Now, again, the English were fortunate that several governor generals were very competent, ambitious men, and one who followed Clive outdid Clive, and he was well known as Warren Hastings. And Warren Hastings extended the empire further into the interiors, and on a rather small pretext started a war with the descendants of Afghan Muslims who had settled in central India, called Rohillas. And again, he lined his own pockets as well as that of the company, and a huge amount of booty was collected. He succeeded in getting a gift of several £100,000, and so much so that when he returned to England, the opposite party, led by Edmund Burke, put him on trial and decided to impeach. And there was a famous trial that went on for almost 7 years in the British Parliament, and eventually he was exonerated. But that was one of the first examples when the British Parliament paid attention to the events that took place. And there were a few decent people on that side that they realized that the Indian population was being exploited by by that time what they used to be called Nawabs of India. Now, again, just to give you an idea about the various European colonies which were extending all the way from the English, French, Portuguese, Dutch, and again, you would be surprised to say that even the peace-loving Danes had colonies at that time. Obviously, that was a rather small venture, and they did not go any further. And the winners of this big race turned out to be the British or English. And again, just to give you an idea of the political setting of that time, that's where the three main empires, initially the Muslim Empire, followed by the Mughal Empire, followed by the Maratha Empire in a span of over 400 years. And all of these folded with the rise of the British Empire that started in 1757, and gradually over the next 50 to 75 years managed to conquer the almost whole of India, from border of Afghanistan to the southern tips. And now they left the local princes alone, and that gave rise to a sort of moth-eaten India, as we'll see in the next few minutes. Now, these were the individuals who were at some time or the other were rulers of the three major powers. The one on the left is King, last significant king of the Mughal Empire, Aurangzeb, who was a rather more fundamentalist Islam and reversed the tradition of Mughal kings that preceded him. In the middle are the Afghan king, who raided India from the north but did not settle, and they just managed to loot New Delhi and defeated the southern kings of Marathas. On the other side is the English Governor General Wellesley, Arthur Wellesley, who succeeded in extending the empire, and he managed to defeat the various Maratha designate Peshwas one by one over a span of about 25 years. And again, the Marathas received a big setback in 1761 from the Afghans and Persians who marched from the Khyber Pass, and after losing that battle they never ventured further out in the north. And again, they were involved in infighting between the amongst themselves and with the East India Company, even after the decline of the Mughal Empire. Now, we talked about William Jones in the past, who was a linguist and established the relationship between European languages and started Western education in India in the earlier lectures, so we won't dwell into it too much. And this is some of the linguistic similarities are well outlined in this slide as to the word from Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, English, and Hindi are quite similar over the span of thousands of years. And again, you can see the numbers are also digits from 1 to 10 are also well preserved across the various Indo-European languages. Now, this was in the early 19th century, there was the start of the English education. The English established colleges to train the locals to act as a go-between, and this was now the Bengali Hindus or the upper class Hindus were the first to take up Western education, and again, the Muslims were rather reluctant to establish at that time, and it took them another 50 or so years to establish a special Muslim universities. Now, an interesting sidekick on that time was one of the powerful sultans in the south who controlled what is present-day Mysore and Bangalore in that region, and he adopted European tactics to train his army and was interested in extending the Islamic control not just over India, but also communicated with the Ottoman Empire and the Egyptian king to establish or re-establish rather caliphate. Now so the Mysore kingdom went through various battles, and he and his French-trained army gave English considerable fight over one or two Mysore wars, and finally after the third war the English were able to subdue him, and more on that in a few minutes. And again, at that time, none of these local powers to be were never able to collaborate. Neither the Marathas, the Tipu Sultan, and the rich Muslim kingdom of Nizam, none of them were able to collaborate with each other against the foreign powers, and gradually they lost their kingdoms to English one by one. Some of them were bribed and bought over, some of them lost in battles, and again the lack of adequate training and lack of adequate finances was their big downfall. Now, Tipu Sultan was well memorized even in selling curry powder in England, so he was forced to be reckoned with, and so much so that he had Europeans create a toy in which the Tipu the tiger is at the throat of an Englishman, and it plays some music, and this toy is still displayed in the British Museum as until very recent times. And now a man who finally defeated Tipu Sultan should be well known to Americans, and his name was Charles Cornwallis. As you may recall, in the Battle of Independence, he surrendered to Washington in 1781. Subsequently, he was appointed as an ambassador, and in his last big post ended up as Governor General of Southern India. Now, he created several reforms. He changed the taxation. He started the survey of the land that was under company rule, and again tried to put a stop on the private trading that was carried out by the East India Company employees. And since that time, the English systematically became landlords and the fixed taxes, thus increasing the revenue for the East India Company substantially. And to his credit, he was honest and turned down the gift that was offered to him as a part of the victory against Tipu Sultan. And again, the English were very fortunate in getting very competent governor generals. The next one who came along was a famous governor general named Richard Wellesley, and his brother is equally famous as Arthur Wellesley, and better known as Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. And again, Richard Wellesley uh, created several alliances with the Marathas and the Nizam of in central India, and finally uh, succeeded in dissolving the empire of Tipu Sultan. And at the same time, they created certain reforms in India, establishment of various colleges and botanical garden, etc. Now, another interesting side connection that would be interested in to know that the Bombay harbor was not just for trading, but was also a shipyard that was controlled by the local merchants. The reason why it was selected because the Indian wood was of better quality, and the ship that was involved in the War of 1812, named HMS Minton, was built in Bombay harbor, and the rockets that went up, which inspired Francis Scott Key to write Star Spangled Banner, were reverse engineered after the fight with Tipu Sultan. Now, at the same time, the Bengali Hindus were quick to adopt and to Western style education, and the well-known reformer was a gentleman named Raja Ram Mohan Rai. He saw the changes that were needed in the traditional Hindu society, and he established a separate religious movement called Brahmo Samaj, and he was interested in combining the good elements of Christianity as well as the Hindu tradition. And he, on his own, he was fluent in several languages and managed to even travel to England and worked with several well-known English who is who. And unfortunately, he died in England of after rather a short illness, and was buried in the London suburbs, as it's shown in his and the plaque in his as his memorial. And at that time, the English, to their credit, did try to reform some of the bad traditions of Hinduism, primarily a tradition called sati, which involved a burning of the widows on the funeral pyre of their late husband. And with the collaboration of the Indian reformers, Lord Bentinck, who established a law banning the practice of sati. And again, at that time, English was becoming a language of administration and commerce, and replacing Persian, which was the traditional language in the Muslim era. Again, followed by another competent governor general named Dalhousie, who managed to alienate a lot of local Indian princes by instituting something called a doctrine of lapse. That by that is meant that if they did not have a male child or heir apparent, then their empire or territories will lapse into the company rule. And now this again caused a lot of friction and on the part of that was at least one of the causes for the Indian Mutiny, which took place in 1857, along with several others, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. Now again, by that time, the English had enough of the heat of Calcutta, and during the summer months, the capital of India was moved to the foothills of Himalayas in a town called Simla, and the country was ruled from that town. And the Simla is still was in a very European fashion, and it was quite segregated. By that time, telegraph and railways were making headways into Indian subcontinents, and so the communications were improving. Now, the ruling of India was done by what was known as Indian Civil Service, which was already established in the several hundred years ago. Now, as I mentioned earlier, not only the English and the French were there, but several other ethnic minorities had made their forays into India. A good example of that being a gentleman named David Sassoon, who was an Iraqi Jew, who after persecution from the Iraqi sultans managed to find his way into India and was quite successful. And his dynasty is still apparent by what is known as the Sassoon dock in India. And he traded in textiles and opium trading later on to China, and extended his empire from India from Bombay to Calcutta to Shanghai. And some of his descendants migrated back to England, and one of them was knighted and ended up marrying a Rothschild family. And this was the sort of political map of India. As you can see, that they left several areas under the local princes, but they kept the control on the military, as well as they made sure that the princes and the Maharajas behaved in line. And some of them, their kingdoms were fairly large. One of the central one, and by a Muslim sultan named Nizam, was as large as France and was quite wealthy. Now, again, by that time, some of the Indians had succeeded in traveling to the west, and one of the gentlemen named Azimullah Khan went all the way to Britain to appeal for the king for whom he was employed. And on his way back, he traveled via Crimea and saw that the Muslim were not always subjugated in the Western, and how they were well trained and were able to fight the European powers. And that again may have been one of the causes for inciting the local Muslim population into restoring the old glories that they had, and they had lost to the English in a span of a few years. And so some of the causes that need to be examined for the revolt are political, the loss of the privy of the monies that were paid to the local kings, continuing decline of the economic conditions with cash crops and poor monsoon leading to further famines, and again the social causes. Some of the religious sentiments were upset by the British, and now some of the most obvious causes, which was the triggering factor, was a new rifle that was sent to the Indian sepoys, which had a cartridge, as you can see, that required biting by teeth, and that was rumored, and what probably was greased with fat, which could have come from cow or pig, again upsetting the sensibilities of both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. And that was the spark that started the Indian Mutiny. Now, the mutiny was primarily confined to the northern regions and the military areas between, extending from Delhi to Calcutta. It never made it to the south. Again, the leaders of the mutiny were poorly organized, and they were naive enough they did not even cut the telegraph cables. And again, they were short of finances and good weaponry. And at the same time, some of the local Maharajas and Rajput kings did not support the mutiny, and the English had better resources, and it took them 6 months to send the relief from Europe, but they were able to send relief, and were finally became victorious. Now again, at that time, not just the Governor Generals, but a very reformer named Thomas Macaulay had a lot to do with replacing Persian to English. He also reformed the Indian Penal Code, and so much so that a lot of the well-educated Indians were tongue-in-cheek called Macaulay's children. And he did not have a good opinion for neither the Indian or neither Hindu or the Muslim culture of that time, as is apparent in his statement. Now, the other ventures that the English got into was they were afraid of the spreading of Russian Empire through all the stans, and the border was drawn at Afghanistan, so they ventured into Afghanistan and managed to keep Afghanistan under control, but behaved rather rashly and upset the local sensibilities, and finally decided to withdraw, only to be wiped out to the last man by the Afghans, who were sitting up high on the mountain passes in the middle of winter. And the Afghan irregulars made a quick work and and nearly all of the people were brutally killed. Only the physician who managed to return back to the borders of northwest India. And now, this again at the same time, the English and Western education was being established by the founding of the University of Bombay in 1857, and various colleges were started even earlier, including medical college. And as the buildings are still standing and being used currently by University of Bombay. And again, the Industrial Revolution was affecting the subcontinents with the arrival of telegraph, railways, postal service, etc. Primarily, they were used for military services, and the administration of India was carried out by Europeans and the British, who were trained at Hailbury College, which was founded as early as 1806, in learning various native languages, laws, mathematics, classics, and some of the Indian teachers were hired to teach Persian and various native languages. And the history of the mutiny was rather difficult, and there were huge atrocities that occurred on both sides with retributions, and some of them were mass hanging and a burning of entire villages, at the same time humiliating the Muslims and Hindus by making them eat pig or cow meat was carried out by the British when they became victorious. And again, that may have been the rise of jihad and Wahhabism, and which continues to pervade through entire Saudi Arabia and a huge part of the Islamic world until the present time. Now, there were several Afghan wars which took place, and the powers went back and forth between the local princes, and that we'll examine that later on. And as you can see, the spread of railways was rather quick. On a span of about 40 years, the whole of subcontinent was well covered by railway network from north to south, rivaling that of Europe. And these are some of the examples of the mass hanging and carried out. And the ultimate cause of the mutiny was that the East India Company was dissolved, and Queen Victoria took over the power, and the control of India was run by what was known as India Council, and instead of the Governor General, a Viceroy was appointed, and the Indian civil service continued to function as de facto rulers under the Viceroy and various Governor Generals by the direct rule by the Crown that took place. And the interesting story of the diamond as to how it ended up into the royal crown is worth sharing. The diamond was originally mined in southern India and ended up with the Muslim sultans, subsequently with the Mughal sultans, and then from that was stolen or taken away in a raid by the Persian king Nadir Shah. Again, when the Persian Empire was collapsing, the diamond ended up with the Afghan kings, and later on with the small kingdom of Sikh kingdom, which rose on the borders of present-day Punjab. And when the Sikh, after the third Sikh war, the 12-year-old Sikh prince was advised by his minder, who was British, of course, to give the diamond as a gift to Her Majesty Queen Victoria, and he ended up being taken to Europe to be made into a European gentleman. Obviously, he had the purse and the monies, and he ended up spending most of his life in England. And even though he was welcome to parties and was friendly with various upper class establishment of Britain, they did not want him to get married to a British woman, and subsequently they did find an Armenian Christian wife for him, and he unfortunately, and he did not survive, became alcoholic and died. But that is an interesting story of how the Kohinoor diamond from southern India ended up in the royal crown of Queen Victoria and is still worn proudly by Queen Elizabeth. And all the countries have asked for return, and the